Welcome to the 6Ps podcast and our first episode in our series on Miles Franklin's novel, My Brilliant Career. Today we're going to run through some background information and details that will be very useful for you prior to reading the text. So to give you an overview of today, we'll start by looking at some setting and context information. We'll delve into the plot, the characters and some themes. We'll focus a little bit on text construction as well as authorial intent. So some basics on the novel. This novel was first published in 1901, but was withdrawn from publication not long after. However, it was then republished in 1966, a couple of decades after the author's death. The reason why it was withdrawn was because the author's family or people associated with the author felt like they were depicted in this text, and therefore Miles Franklin, who was 21 at the time of publication, took it upon herself to withdraw it. Now, it should be noted that Miles Franklin is a female author as well, and perhaps you can consider why she used the writer's name Miles Franklin to publish this text. It gives you a little bit of insight into the time period. The novel is set in rural New South Wales, and the story follows the life of Sibylla Melvin and her adolescence and early childhood. I'm going to run through a summary now, and there might be some spoilers, but it is set in rural New South Wales before Federation, so very late 19th century. And the novel traces the life of a young woman named Sibylla. Her father is unable to make it work at their farm on Possum Gully, due to the environment, I guess. It's very harsh, and faces massive debt, and along with that is an alcoholic, and there are issues that stem from this. Sibylla has strong views on her freedom and independence, but is forced to work on the farm in order for the family to survive financially. Fortuitously, towards the beginning of the text, she is invited to live with her grandmother and Aunt Helen at Caddagat, a prosperous farm. Aunt Helen seeks to transform Sibylla into a beautiful woman. That's from, I guess, a physical point of view, because Sibylla thinks she's quite plain. At Caddagat, life is comfortable and enjoyable for Sibylla, who acclimatizes quickly to the beauty of her surroundings. In addition, she's able to indulge in her two loves, literature and music. This is in stark contrast to life at Possum Gully, where she's forced to, I guess, be a labourer. Throughout her time at Caddagat, she develops a strong bond with Harold, or Hal. He is a farm owner not too far away from Caddagat. He proposes marriage to her, which Sibylla agrees to, but only given she assumes he will find someone better eventually, because she doesn't really have strong views on marriage. However, things change for Sibylla, who on orders from her mother and father is forced to take a job at Barney's Gap in order to assist in dealing with her father's debts. Life at Barney's Gap is tough. The conditions are dark and dirty, and Sibylla desperately seeks assistance from her mother and grandmother to bail her out, to no effect. After a physical breakdown, Sibylla is able to return to Possum Gully. Soon after, Harold comes to visit her to once again propose marriage, but Sibylla remains steadfast in not succumbing to life as a married woman. If we look at the historical context, so we're going back, over 100 years ago, the states federated, the 6 states federated in 1901, which was the year of publication. And there was sort of a sentiment of parochialism in Australia at the time, between states particularly. It was more so than this whole patriotic national identity. And you can look at even little things like the fact that in Victoria and New South Wales, the two biggest states, they had different size railway lines. So Australia was definitely, I guess, a little bit of there were these 6 states that were all very different. Now, the 1890s was difficult as well, because it was the worst drought on record since colonisation, and as a result, it had a really big impact on the economy and increased the poverty around the country. Now, Miles Franklin, she grew up on a farm near the Snowy Mountains, which is where this text is sort of set, and that's where she wrote the text. So when we think about the fact that she ended up getting the book withdrawn from publication, we can maybe suggest that this is a little bit of a similar story or similar environment to what she grew up in. I think it's important as well to note the suffrage movement. So Women attained the right to vote in South Australia in 1894. They were the first state to allow women, or give women, I should say, most women, the right to vote, because of course Indigenous women were not given that, or First Nations women were not given that opportunity. And in federal elections, women were able to vote 1902. So the first election would be 1904 that they were allowed to vote in. So when we talk about gender, it's really important to note the rights and responsibilities that women had at this time, which is vastly different to, I guess, what we have today. In terms of the setting, we're in rural Australia. We're in farms in and around the Goulburn region, so south of Goulburn, the Monaro Snowy Mountains region in New South Wales. I already mentioned drought, but it's important to note that the two extremes of nature are explored in this text. So we've got the beauty of the Australian landscape juxtaposed with the harsh consequences of the drought. And what's important to note is the landscape that the protagonist finds herself in often dictates her experiences. So if the land is really harsh or really dark and dirty, these aren't positive experiences for Sibylla, but in the more beautiful places like Kattegat, she's able to thrive. So the importance of nature is really showcased through this novel. Something else as well just to think about is the distinct social classes that were around at the time, particularly given we are in a rural setting as well. There are probably 4 key settings in this text. It begins in chapter 1 in Braggabrong, and you can see the descriptions here. This is where Sibylla's first memories were of. So we've got the majestic gum trees surrounding us, the sun glinting on their straight white trunks and falling on the gurgling fern-banked stream which disappeared beneath a steep scrubby hill, and also the fact that there was seldom a female face. From these quotations, we get, once again, that vivid atmosphere and an environment, some sensory language in there as well. So we're really sort of placed in the protagonist's shoes, but also a little bit about the lack of women in her life early on, and the fact that farms particularly were male-dominated spheres. The next section of the text is in Possum Gully, where it's a really harsh time for Sibylla's family. She says, "My first impression of Possum Gully was bitter disappointment." She says how flat, common and monotonous the scenery appeared, and the fact she felt cramped in her, or our, she's talking about her family's, new run. So once again, we've got a really negative description of the farm at Possum Gully, and therefore her experiences there are not favourable. We shift then, for the majority of the text, to Kattegat. This is where her Aunt Helen and her grandmother live. She describes it by saying the gurgling rush of the creek, the scent of the flower-laden garden, and the stamp of horses in the orchard. The warmth was delightful. Summer is heavenly, I said. Life is a joy. That's on page 229. This is a really, again, positive experience for Sibylla when she's able to enjoy herself in a really beautiful natural experience. Barney's Gap comes next. We've got some quotes here from Sibylla's point of view again. The house, which was built in a narrow gully between 2 steep stony hills, which, destitute of grass, rose like grim walls of rock, imparting a desolate and prison-like aspect. There's a simile in there as well. Another quote from the same page. I was followed by the children through the dirtiest passage into the dirtiest room to sit upon the dirtiest chair to gaze upon the other dirty furniture. So once again, we've got this dark, dirty space, which is, again, not favourable for Sibylla. I should say the last couple of chapters of the text are set in Possum Gully. So she returns to Possum Gully after being at Barney's Gap. So once again, the sensory language is used to describe these settings and the impact they have on our main character. I wanted to touch upon the role of women just briefly as well, because it's obviously really important. Something to note too, when this text was obviously written, literature from women writing literature was starting to boom. Prior to that, pretty much most texts were written by men. Marriage was seen as aspirational for women at the time, and being a wife and mother was seen as a main priority for many women. You'll note not so much though for our main character, which is really interesting and what makes I think this text quite unique. Marriage was also used by families for economic, social and political gains. Now, while Sibylla's mother comes from a prosperous family, her husband eventually becomes poor and is unable to escape life in Possum Gully. And I wanted to talk a little bit here briefly with this quote: when a woman is separated from her husband, it is a religion of the world at large to cast the whole blame on the wife. This idea that marriage became inescapable for women. They couldn't leave their marriage. They were stuck there because if, divorce was not unheard of, but wasn't very common at all. And if that happened, then the woman was blamed for that. So again, very different to what we sort of would see now. In terms of femininity, Sibylla continually struggles with her physical appearance and the value she, and by extension society, places on physical appearance in terms of what a woman can bring to a man or to the society. Now, as she sees herself as not naturally beautiful, especially in comparison to her sister Gertie, it impacts on her self-esteem to an extent. Because while she doesn't necessarily see herself as beautiful and fit to be a wife, she doesn't necessarily want to be a wife. So Sibylla's quite a complex character. We'll touch upon her in a little bit, but she's a little bit of a contradiction at times too. In terms of careers, it was uncommon or difficult at the time for women to aspire to having a career. Note that Sibylla, her mother and siblings are forced into working on the farm in order to help the family to survive financially. Something else to look at, and potentially you can look at this when you do some more research, but the title of the book was meant to be My Brilliant Career, with a question mark after brilliant. We could suggest this is just sort of sarcasm as well. So you can even look into that. And obviously we mentioned it briefly before, the suffrage movement and the fact that women were only able to vote at federal elections from 1902 onwards. So again, this shifting increase in responsibilities that women had that we can see gradually improve until sort of World War II and then beyond. In terms of characters, our protagonist is Sibylla Melvin. She is the narrator of the text, and she's quite a complex character, and we get to delve into that character throughout the text. She's unconventional, she's religionless, she considers herself unwomanly, a tomboy and very plain. Some of these quotes are from her mother as well, which is interesting. She believes she is not physically beautiful and therefore unfit, or more to the point, she's unwilling to become a wife, but she is a talented writer and musician. Now we've got her love interest here, which is Harold Hal Beecham. He's a landowner and a farmer. He does lose his land though towards the end of the text before getting it back. He is physically quite strong. He's described as being a very young man, a bushman, tremendously tall and big and sunburnt. We've got Sibylla's parents, Richard and Lucy. We've got here father was admitted into swelldom because of who he married in terms of Lucy. So he sort of married up, but he's an alcoholic, while her mother is stuck in marriage and poverty, even though she came from a wealthy family. Note to the power that they hold over Sibylla, being her parents. They're able to dictate where she goes in her movements in her adolescence. We've got Sibylla's grandmother and Aunt Helen, who both live at Kattegat and look after her. And Aunt Helen's important because she transforms Sibylla from a physical perspective, yet can't alter her views and values and desire to be married. There are other characters you can look at as well. Obviously, these are sort of the most common ones, but you've got Gertie, who is Sibylla's sister. You've got them Swats, who live at Barney's Gap. She stays with them. They're a really nice comparison to draw to her own parents in terms of social class, but also morality. You've got Frank Horden, who's a bit of a pest at Kattegat. Everett Gray, who comes from Sydney, and Uncle JJ, who also lives at Kattegat. You've also got some of her other siblings as well. Sibylla has other siblings as well that appear throughout the text. But the main sort of two characters, I guess, really are Sibylla and Hal. In terms of key themes, what you'll probably want to be focusing on when you read the text are gender and identity particularly, and the way that Sibylla deals with this. You've got the institution of marriage. That is definitely worthwhile exploring. Things like social class, isolation, family, conflict, love, storytelling, religion, power, and I guess Australia as a nation, the Australian identity, particularly at the end of the text, is really important. So something that I want you to have a look at and focus on, particularly probably the second time you read the text, is your next level analysis. Thinking about not just what is written in the text, but how it's written. So information like context detail, linguistic, stylistic and structural features, symbols and motifs, and authorial intent are all details that you can add into your essays and analysis to show that you're going to the next level in terms of the way you analyse My Brilliant Career. I wanted to touch briefly on some literary features. So we've already seen a few quotes, but descriptive language and sensory language is, it appears throughout the text. There's a really strong focus on describing the Australian landscape in order to create and paint a vivid and authentic atmosphere, particularly one from a woman's point of view. To add to that authentic picture, you probably want to look at things like farming jargon, so words to do with farming, as well as the Australian vernacular that come up a lot. And what's interesting is, obviously it's told from Sibylla's point of view, but when characters who are less educated speak, we see more of that Australian vernacular. So your ability to write and to speak particularly does reflect your educational status. Like all text, there's symbols and motifs that appear throughout, as well as similes and metaphors. I think the similes and metaphors particularly come from Sibylla's point of view, and we gain an insight through those figurative features, the way she views the world and the way she views herself. Something else to pick up on is the biblical references. These appear throughout the text, particularly they come up a lot in chapter titles. So have a look at those, find out their meaning and where they appear in the Bible, and think about how they reflect the widespread Christian values at the time when Christianity was widespread throughout Australia. In terms of the style and structure, I'll do that again. In terms of the style and structure of this text, it is a first-person perspective. So we see the world through Sibylla's eyes in what is quite a patriarchal society. The character at times directly addresses the audience as well, and you note that in the introduction, she uses second person, you. It's also generally a linear structure. There is an introduction. Chapter 1 is like a reflection on her whole life, but from chapter 2 onwards, it's in a linear, structure. And there are a range of different text types. So there's obviously about 38 chapters, but they feature things like diary entries and letters, poems, question and answer conversations. It's not just a novel, There's different text types that feature throughout. And that's what makes this text unique. So when you see these sort of text types, it's well worth making note of them, because they're maybe potentially some unique examples that you can use when it comes to analysing the text in your essays. I wanted to touch on authorial intent as well, and thinking about why the author wrote this text. So ideas to consider are the fact that, it provides a female perspective of the rural Australian experience. This is a quote from Miles Franklin herself. She said, "It came home to me as a great blow that it was only men who could take the world by its ears and conquer their fate, while women, metaphorically speaking, were forced to sit with tight hands and patiently suffer as the waves of fate tossed them hither and thither, battering and bruising without mercy." So really think about the way Miles Franklin tries to provide independence and freedom to a female protagonist. Miles Franklin also wants to question the purpose and expectation of marriage, and that a life of freedom and independence is possible for women. She highlights the real challenges faced by, farmers and workers in rural Australia. There's drought, there's poverty, and it's quite inescapable. And this is something to note, particularly in the last chapter. She wants to celebrate the Australian identity through the beauty of the landscape and the beauty of the people. Something I wanted to touch upon as well is the prefaces. So there's 2 introductions to the text. The first one is by Jennifer Byrne. She's a journalist, she's a TV host. She provides a modern perspective on the text, and she calls it one of the early works of feminism, and that it was the Australianists that first captured the people's imagination. Sibylla flowed directly from the young Franklin's own sense of blocked possibilities, and that Miles Franklin belonged to another generation and another world, that she was quite ahead of her time is what Jennifer Byrne sort of insinuates that. So definitely worth reading that, and particularly from that idea of this being a work of feminism. That's a modern preface, and then we've got, one from the time, which is Henry Lawson. He is a celebrated writer and poet, and he was one of the reasons why this book got published. He provides some context to the novel and highlights its authenticity. He says the book is true to Australia, the truest I've ever read. He also states, though, that I don't know about the girlish emotional parts of the book, which I guess underscores the gender division and the stereotypes of the time. It's really interesting too, because Henry Lawson wrote the text that we've actually studied a couple of years ago. When we did the drover's wife. Here we sort of saw life from a woman's point of view, but it came from a male author. So I think this, obviously, My Brilliant Career, a female perspective from a female author, just makes it that more authentic. Now, there is a film that was released in 1979, and it's something that you can watch on the streaming services. Students often ask me, is it worth watching the film? And I say, well, there's two trains of thought. I think it's always good to watch a film if you're someone who's quite visual, that wants to see the characters, that wants to see the landscape, that needs that sort of validation. So if that's you, definitely watch the film. It also does provide a good focus on Sibylla, the main character. But the reason why I'd say probably no to watching it potentially is that it does slightly differ, the plot, from the novel. It's quite short too. It's an hour and a half. That might be a good thing for you, but it does move very quickly, and the opening is quite short as well, and it can impact on your knowledge of the novel. And we hate it when in exams the student references something from the text, for the film adaptation rather than the text itself. We've seen that particularly with a couple of texts in recent years. So again, there's positives and negatives to watching the film. I'll make you make up your own choice, but it's available on a couple of streaming services at the moment. So check it out if you want to. So to close today, just a couple of points. Definitely conduct further background research on the social, cultural, and historical context of the novel and 19th century Australia. I'd also encourage you to read Susan K. Martin's essay on the text, and there's a link in the show notes. Read the novel once for understanding, then a second time to highlight the key moments, analyse the themes, and look at the way the text is constructed. So looking at the sensory language, the symbols and motifs, those kinds of aspects. And once you've done that, you can start building a quotation bank. If you can do that as soon as possible, that would be really good. Break it up into characters or themes or text features. And what you can do is, if you work out that certain, ideas or certain themes or quotes to do with themes and ideas keep coming up, they're the ones worth memorizing, because themes and ideas don't work in isolation. They're all connected together. So the quicker you can start building a quotation bank, the better. We'll have some more episodes throughout the year. So keep posted, subscribe, and we'll speak to you next time on the 6Ps podcast.